So as I researched the seafarers, I also started looking at other lines of work. And I was thinking, what would make that antique jar interesting? If this family could have owned anything, what if they owned something that no one else realized had much value?
Welcome to Book Reporter Talks To, where our guest today is return guest Charmaine Wilkerson, and we're going to be talking about her latest book, Good Dirt, which, like her previous book, Black Cake, is a Book Reporter Bets On selection. I absolutely love her work. It's the kind of work that when I get in and start reading one of her books, I'm immersed in the people's lives. I feel like I know them. I feel like after I've left, I want to spend more time with them. And that's a great way to sit down and read a book. So, Charmaine, thanks for joining us today. I've got so many questions. Our reviewer, Jane Krebs, loved the book. And some of her feelings are things that I'm going to weave into the questions today.
Well, first of all, it's great to see you again, Carol. Thanks so much for reading this new book.
So good. Absolutely so good. And the gorgeous cover, everything. We're going to get into it all. But let's start with you telling us about Good Dirt. Just give us like your elevator pitch for it.
Well, like my writing, typical of my writing, it's a number of different things, but I like to tell people that I wrote a book about a young woman from Connecticut who decides to run away from home at age 29. Why? Because she's grown up on the Connecticut coast in a loving family, but she has struggled for years with painful memories
Mm.
from related to a childhood tragedy that cost the life of her brother. And also she's suffering from a more recent, very public, very embarrassing end to an important romance. So all of that just pushes her away. She decides she needs to distance herself and basically hide. So this is the story of Ebby Freeman. Only Ebby Freeman is going to find that her past catches up with her, even when she runs off to France. And she's going to have to turn around and take a new look at everything that it means to be Ebby Freeman.
Exactly who she is and how she's defining herself all these years and how other people are defining her as well. You know, she's such a great character. Our reviewer said, Ebby Freeman is character to treasure. We see the deep search in what she has forgotten and what she must remember in order to bring her to a quiet resolution of her own worth. She needs to go with both. Was she the first character that you saw as you started writing? Was Ebby it?
Yes, Abby was it. I think you know from before that I tend to write from a point of emotion or a
Mhm.
question that I have, in my mind, or maybe an image that comes to me. So one day, Abby Freeman came to me as a little girl on the worst day of her life. And before I even saw Abby, I heard her. And
Mm.
I knew what was happening in a home where she lived on the Connecticut coast. And one of the things that happened was you could hear this jar,
Mhm.
this family heirloom that's been in the Freeman family for six generations, falling from a table and hitting the floor. And then the very worst thing happens. Ultimately, Ebby loses her brother. It's a home invasion robbery. They don't know who did this. They don't really know much. They only know that their family's been upended. And luckily, she survives, but she survives with the weight of all that it means to be the surviving child, to be the one who saw things happen, to be the one who yearns even for the jar that fell, because that represented so much that was positive in their
Mhm.
family. But
Yeah.
yes, I saw that scene on the very first day. I just didn't know much about the jar. And as
Mhm.
I did research, then it began to take on its own life.
And it's a whole different thing. And I love the connection between she and her brother. And though he's not on the page for very long at all, their playfulness with each other, the way he's chiding her to, like, one more time. She goes, one more time, I want to do it. Let me do this. And you saw the playfulness that was such a big part of their connection together. And then when that's gone, and she hides things too, she hides things for a very long time about that day. And you can just picture a child being eaten up inside, like, I'm going to go get the neighbor. Somebody's got to come help me. And you see that helplessness right from the beginning. And then where does this person heal and go on from there? So that's what I saw when I was looking at Ebby. And she's constantly questioning what's going on. And we come to she and her brother, whose name is Baz, and their parents are these warm, friendly people. And we see their lives. And all of a sudden, we do a pullback shot, and we see that they're the only Black family in very white Connecticut, in this shoreline town. But at the beginning, we just see a family. And then all of a sudden, they get an extra definition on top of them. And did you plan that like from the beginning of like, let me just introduce you to them? Let me just get you to them.
Yeah, Ebby just came to me and she was this little girl. And yes, I knew that she was a little girl growing up in the only Black family in her particular neighborhood. And how was that possible? It was an exclusive beachside community, right there on the Long Island Sound. So they had money and they had status. And so the question was, what were they doing there? And that was a process of discovery for me, Carol.
Mhm.
I started on the worst day, the most dramatic day, and I pulled out in my imagination to a broader view of this family. And I also thought that antique vase on the first page that I wrote, it was an antique vase and then became a jar.
Mhm.
And what was it? Why was it there and what would make it fall?
Mhm.
That also became a process of discovery as I began to do research into why an African American family with a long and rather prestigious history in Massachusetts, why would this generation of that family end up in that particular neighborhood being so conspicuous that for the rest of her childhood, as she grows up, Ebby Freeman is not only that little girl who survived the tragedy, but that little Black girl.
Mhm.
What does all of that mean? And so what we discover is there's a story to the jar, and the jar does have something to do with the fact that they're an African American family. But what is it doing there?
Mhm.
If it was created, if it was made by an enslaved man in the American South. And all of that came through research as I just asked, who are these people?
Mhm.
What are they doing there? I wanted the jar to have some kind of meaning because if they had that much wealth, they could have bought anything. They could have
Right.
had an ancient jar from another culture. They could have had something beautiful and delicate from China, but they have this big old food storage jar that when people look at it, they don't even see beauty
Mhm.
immediately. And that story grew. And that story, the story of that artifact, tells us something about who these people are, this
Mhm.
family, um, from hardship to prosperity, from difficult times to better times. And also, the stories reveal their mirth, their playfulness, the love they have for one another, the love they have for New England and for Connecticut and for Massachusetts.
Yeah, and she also has these things that she holds on to I think it's an alarm clock from her brother that's set to a certain time. And her boyfriend later is just crazed. Like, why are you holding on to this? And it's interesting because it, like the jar to me, was something that you're holding on to your past. You're clutching it in this thing that you have to have with you at any time. And what inspired you to include, like, there's this little thing from her brother that is her daily look at and remember her brother.
I hate to be a bore, Carol, but it just came to me. It just
I
came to
love
me.
it.
But if I want to step back and take a more, intelligent analysis of this, I am fascinated by the power that stories have. As you know, that influenced my writing of my debut novel, Black Cake. What is the power that a story has to help us shape our sense of self, in other words, identity, and our ideas of culture and family and the ways in which we think we should be living our lives? So, in the case of Ebby, so much of her story has been dominated by that terrible event when she was just 10 years old. So she grows up in a well-off family. She loves being from Connecticut. She gets a good education. She has an interesting job as an editor that she enjoys, and she's about to be married also at the beginning of the novel. And so she has all of this, but she keeps feeling that she's sort of caught or trapped by this dominant element of her story, which is that little girl who survived that terrible event. So everything that she reaches for, it's not so much just the past. She's reaching for whoever she was before she lost her brother.
Mm-hmm.
She wants to undo the loss of her brother, just as her parents do. Who would not, right? Who wouldn't? And so she's kind of stuck in this loop in which she's unable to free herself from that, in part because what happened to her put her front and center in the news. So the
Mm-hmm.
reason I started writing about this young woman is I used to be a television journalist, and I used to find myself from quite a young age walking into a person's home, a stranger's home, on the worst day of their life. And
Mm-hmm.
this is a very serious thing to say, but
Right,
that's where Ebby came from. And I
right.
used to think, how will they manage? Well, people do. People do find ways to move forward. You know, we're wired to live well, we're wired to hope, we are wired to love and laugh despite unspeakable things that may happen to us. And so it's kind of an exploration of that. And she keeps trying to reach back to reclaim who she was before. And who she was before was this playful, pesky kid in a loving family
Mm-hmm.
that jokes around and plays book games and loves to be outdoors and loves to go clamming. So she keeps trying to reach for that, but what she's trying to do is remove what happened to her.
Mm-hmm.
And the tough question of the story is, how does she go forward without removing it? Because she can't. She
Mm-mm.
can't undo what has happened to her. So how does she find a way to embrace all the best of who she is and somehow live with what has happened to her? That's the heavy part of the story. But the answer lies in everything that she has lived and gone through that is um, a reality for a loving family with a history in
Mm-hmm.
Massachusetts, with a history also in the American South.
Yeah, and as she's going along, there's this other thing that defines her that happens very early in the book. And as a result, she's just like, okay, enough. I'm going to go escape to France. I'm going to go over, do someplace else. She comes into this idyllic place, and then her past finds her again, this poor girl. She just can't get away. But at the same time, I feel like she's having such an awakening about herself and what matters to her. And it's fun for the reader to watch her embracing being there, being away from her parents, being away from explaining to everybody what her life is. She's just Ebby when she's there. You don't go, "Hi, my name is Ebby. My brother Baz died when I was like 10 years old. And then this happened." And you don't meet people and say that. And so I feel like she's coming into a place where I'm just Ebby. I can be me.
Right. She's trying to figure it out because her instinct is to run,
Mhm.
especially when her romantic story goes awry, and that also has been highly publicized.
Mhm.
Um, and she's right to some extent in that the moment she leaves, she feels relief and she's enjoying being where she is.
Mhm.
But can she live in anonymity for the rest of her life? And then if she meets someone new, which may happen when you're in France, do how does she get close to new people if she completely eclipses who she was? So she's caught in this conflict between the relief of not being Ebby, not really, and the realization that, well, she is Ebby. She is
Mhm.
that little girl. So how does she make peace with that?
Yeah. And you're
But then
watching
there's
her,
also
this
sorry,
beautiful
I stepped
place
on you.
reinventing herself.
Yeah, yeah.
And
But of course, there's also, you mentioned there are things that she hasn't told her family about what happened on that day. There's a huge mystery because they've never found the people who killed her brother. And so her parents, too, are living with the weight of this.
Mhm.
But they just want their daughter, their surviving child, to live well.
Right.
Uh, and yet they also have, feelings of guilt, feelings of why did we even move there? What did we do that for? And the destruction of the jar is destroyed on the same day that
Hmm.
Ebby's brother is killed, and it complicates their feelings. I mean, you don't need anything more than to lose someone you love,
Hmm.
but it complicates their feelings because the jar was used to teach those children that even after the worst things, good things can come because the jar has seen it all. And the jar for those young children is like a personality, like a little pot-bellied person. And their mother's even given it a name, Old Mo. And so when that too is destroyed for Ebby and for her parents, it's almost as though the lesson that no matter what happens to you, you can always look forward and think of another way to live your life, even as you carry pain with you.
Hmm.
It's almost as though that lesson has been truncated.
Yeah. Yeah. And she's just sitting there. I'm trying to figure out what I'm going to be, and there's so much undone. Now I want to get redone. Like, where am I going to be? Where am I going to go? The place that she is in France, have you been there? Because that part of the country, Dell.
I have, but you know, and you've seen this in Black Cake, and you will see this in Good Dirt. I don't always name a place.
Hmm.
Later, I may refer, and you can guess where it is, but I intentionally decline to name a specific place, or I invent a name. One, because I don't want it to be too much about the place.
Hmm.
Also, because I like to invent things. I do not want to create an issue in which a person is sitting there going, oh, well, it's not exactly like that. And then how far is the village from the house and
Right, right.
that sort of thing. But it is an actual area in the southwest of France, a bit inland from the sea. And that also has significance.
Hmm.
And yes, I have been there.
Yeah, I've been there. Sort of like go visit the White Lotus hotels, any of the hotels that are featured on White Lotus. Everybody's like, I'm booking, I'm going to Thailand this week, I'm ready to go. It's really interesting.
Yeah, well,
How did you conduct your research about the clay and the jar and the making of this in the South? Because confess, this is something I didn't know anything about, which I guess I'm not the only person, but I love pieces like that. We have a number of jars around the house that were done in the Southwest, but I love to hear how you discovered that and decided to write more about it.
so I actually started writing Good Dirt before Black Cake was published. And I just had this idea and I was going with it. And the first thing that I began to research was the question of what are those four people from that family doing on the Connecticut coast in this particular neighborhood when everyone else has been living in Massachusetts for 5 generations? And also, how did that artifact end up in that family if it came from the American South? But the first thing I started researching was the idea of Ebby's father. He always wanted to live on the coast. He grew up in the interior of Massachusetts. He wanted to live on the coast. He believed it was in his DNA because he had seafarers in his family's past. So I began to research the seafarers, and we're going back now in time to the 1800s, including the part of the 1800s when most Black men in what we call the United States were enslaved.
Hmm.
So imagine that there are people like them sailing up and down the coast of North America. And some of them actually are enslaved. So I found that interesting. And I was reading more. What were slaves doing, enslaved people doing on ships? And why did they actually go back home? So that sort of is research into the dynamics of a person who's living in bondage. And one of the things I began to read about in nonfiction books mostly, but also looking into archives and academic articles, was the idea that really whatever work had to be done had to be done. And if you had people who were held in bondage and obligated to work for you for free, they also would do whatever work had to be done. And so some of them actually were crewing ships, and some of them were unloading things at the docks, and some of them were making pottery or wagon wheels or blacksmithing. So in the United States, we tend to associate the work of enslaved people in the 17 and 1800s with agriculture.
Hmm.
Of course, and that's true. But people who were enslaved were doing other kinds of work as well. So as I researched the seafarers, I also started looking at other lines of work. And I was thinking, what would make that antique jar interesting? If this family could have owned anything, what if they owned something that no one else realized had much value? What would it be? And so it became a food storage jar produced in the American South because as I read, I realized that there were entire teams of enslaved persons, usually men, producing high quality stoneware in the American South. So think South Carolina, near the border with Georgia, not too far from Augusta, well inland from cities like Charleston. Why? Because that area of South Carolina had good dirt. It had a very special kind of soil, and people who knew about pottery, most of them Europeans who came from other countries and who were able to acquire land or set up potteries, they understood that they were dealing with very special clay. They had enslaved people working for them, and some of them were people who had come from countries in Africa and knew something about pottery. Others learned, others grew up learning. So over a few generations, you have highly skilled turners or people who make pottery on, on a wheel, and they were mass producing. So why were they living lives that weren't just the lives of artisans? Because they were obligated to work many, many hours, because they could be sold away from their families, because they could be hurt or killed if they were caught, for example, reading or writing, because they were held in bondage. And so the jar takes us back to a time when a number of things can be true. You can be skilled at making pottery. You can like making pottery. You can work well too many hours. You can worry about being hurt or killed. And you might write things on your pottery, because in my research, I saw that there were people who actually signed pottery. And there was one person in particular who later became famous. And they've even done an exhibit recently about this person who wrote entire phrases and poetry on stoneware jars from that general part of the United States. And I'm going on and on about this, but the point is there's a character in this book who's invented, and what this character does is imagined, but that character would not be plausible without my having learned that there was someone who actually would sign pottery. About the time that I was looking into this, the articles began to surface about someone called Dave the Potter, and this person actually was known for having written poems. How did he do that at a time when it was illegal to teach enslaved people to read and write? How did that happen? How did he manage to do that? Well, he did. And he did so working for someone who had enslaved turners. So it allowed me to imagine a person who would learn to read and write, who was able to write on pottery, who was able to also perform other functions, only everyone looked the other way. And this person creates this jar. But how does the jar end up in Connecticut? Well, that's the story of the jar.
That's the story of the jar and how the jar moves along. And have you gone to a museum where any of this pottery is? Have you seen it in person?
So I had already seen, once in a while you would go to a museum and you would see pottery that had been produced in the American South that might end up in a museum. So I know that I'd seen that before. What was happening during the pandemic, while I was living in Europe and researching this and writing this story, was the birth of a traveling exhibit that began at the Met in New York, moved up to Boston, and moved to a couple of other cities. And this exhibit held a number of jars produced by enslaved people, like the people we've just been talking about. And they also included a number of pieces by that particularly well-known, or well, he wasn't well-known at the time, but became better known, potter who was known to have signed, more than signed, known to have written couplets and phrases on the outside of his jars. And so I walked into that exhibit after I'd already written this novel and was in the editing phase, and walked in and actually found myself tearing up, teary-eyed, because it was as though Moses, one of the characters from the past, and Willis, another character from the past, it was as if I felt as though I sort of had this feeling they really existed. Well, no, I make up the story of Willis and Moses does something that I don't think anyone actually did.
Right.
But they're plausible because I'm seeing now the work of people who really lived in that time period. The jar is made in 1847. It's not a jar that, to my knowledge, ever existed, but it is a jar that could have existed because there really were people producing those artifacts, and there was at least one person known to have written poems, but there were other people who signed and dated their pottery.
Well, I love that it's called Old Mo by the family. They just walk around and go, Old Mo, tapping Old Mo as they go off to school. Let's take our school picture. Let's go tap Old Mo. And it's this talisman in the house as well. So when the day of the worst day of their lives, when this breaks, it's sort of like their good luck charm from the past, their thing that has brought them together as a family in a lot of ways. Everything's fractured at once. So I felt like the jar breaking at the same time Baz dies is like it's a double whammy, like for the family at this point. Now, I have a question. Did you ever want to now go out and try and create pottery? Did you ever sit there and say, I'll go on the wheel and see what this is like?
No, when I was a teenager, I did do some pottery, but hand building, meaning
Okay.
using only one's hands and no wheel. But I do have people in my family who have worked with the wheel. And of course, it's a great American tradition. There are many people of every generation who discover the joy of producing pottery on the wheel. So I actually had to do a bit of research to really insert myself into what that would feel like to bring something up and bring something to life on the
Hmm.
wheel, because I myself never had.
It's so interesting. It's there's this journey of the jar and how it comes to rest in Ed Freeman's hands. And I just love that because I never thought of people as seafaring. I never thought about the craftsmen. I always thought there were people in the fields, you're right, agriculture, and in the big homes, and the slaves with the horses and the buggies and things like that. To define that there were crafts coming out at the same time, to find that there were people on the water and how they were traveling and how you could get away if you were a slave, like by being on a ship and hiding yourself away. Was that a whole other level of research as well about? So we've done pottery, now we're doing ship, how do you really get, where were the lanes? Where did people go?
Well, as I did quite a bit of reading of just nonfiction books, but also, as I mentioned, was looking into articles that, you might not find in the newspaper, but they were academic articles or research articles. And there were documented cases of people who boarded ships because they were hired out by their enslavers to work. And sometimes they would come back. I mean, usually they would come back and they would uh, either pay would go directly to the owner, or they might receive some compensation, and most of that would go to the owner. Or you would have people who would board ships and, well, they'd never come back.
Hmm.
It didn't happen as often as you might think because, well, they're under a certain system. But I was fascinated by that. I read about some people who came back, others who disappeared. I don't want to go into too much spoiler territory, but now we're talking about something that happens in the history of the Freeman family that does involve taking advantage of that system,
Hmm.
taking advantage not only of the system of seafarers, but the systems whereby enslaved people did move around
Hmm.
because they were doing work, because they were doing commerce for the people who held them in bondage, because they were working in workshops in cities. And some of that is something that really came to life for me as I did the research. Many of us actually know about this without realizing it, and this was the revelation I had. Remember the story of Frederick Douglass, who
Hmm.
is famous for having become a prominent, eloquent abolitionist, but first he was enslaved? He escaped enslavement, and initially he did not tell, I don't think he ever really told the full story of who helped him because he wanted to protect people. But what we know from having read his book or having been taught about him is he escaped by pretending to be a sailor. Now, how would a black man who was enslaved manage to escape on a
Right.
train by pretending to be a sailor? Because there were enslaved seafarers, and there also were free seafarers, and sometimes they worked together. And one of the interesting things I thought about was how people who were moving and traveling between cities and cultures, because we think of African Americans, but really they were people of different cultures, some born in countries in Africa, some country born in various territories within the US. They were communicating in part because they were moving around. They were
Hmm.
traveling up and down the coast. They were moving around the country. And so all of these things are interlaced. But going back to the point of Frederick Douglass, the story of Frederick Douglass, a pretty famous abolitionist who escaped by pretending to be a sailor, already had informed us that there were people who were both free and enslaved who were working on sailing ships in the
Hmm.
1800s. We just might not have thought much about that beyond the fact that he'd escaped.
Hmm.
And so, in going back and reading, I began to see there was this whole system of commerce, and it was a system that involved people who used both free born or freed men who were from African countries or European countries or the Americas who were Black, and enslaved men. And it's fascinating. But again, that led me into looking into other lines of work and other things that were used by the people in this story to move forward into other lives.
Yeah. I thought it was interesting because it was the enslaved and free on the ship. Yet, if you pulled into port, they wanted to make sure that the people who were enslaved weren't leaving, that you're going to stay on the ship. You can't go, other places. So to slip away and become, to hide away was very difficult because everybody was watching, because you were the one, wasn't costing any money. There was no money for that person's labor. The other people had lived, they had been born in different places. Their family might have emigrated to different places. They might not have been free. They may never have been a slave. They just may be, this is the way they were. So interesting because then they're on the ship and it's like, wait, I've got 8 enslaved and I've got 4 free. And do I have everybody in head count when I'm leaving? Who jumped
Uh,
off?
yeah, and the interesting thing is, well, enslavement, we think of it as being free labor, but in fact, it was money earning labor in that if a person had um, people who were enslaved, that person might hire out. We hear stories about people who would never be allowed to go into a city or walk around town or work in a workshop or board a ship. But the fact is, many people were hired out. And this is often how people were able to purchase their own freedom
Mhm.
because they were hired out. They might earn a little bit. Let's say there was compensation for the labor of that person if you hired out an enslaved person. But in theory, the person who was the enslaver would get the money. But often the person who was enslaved might receive a small amount. And that was often how people managed to amass, income.
Mhm.
It took them years, but
Mhm.
that's because someone was already earning money because they hired you out. And maybe you had a little on the side. Or maybe they decided to, on some sort of agreement to free people. Obviously, this was not the majority of cases,
Mhm.
but people were actually earning some kind of income, and most of that income went to the person who held the enslaved individual in bondage. So it was kind of a money-making enterprise as well.
Completely, completely. And it's like, and this is how people did move around. This is how they did move around. It's you left your family behind to get yourself forward to someday worry about your family. And it was, we can't all go together. I'm going to go and someday be able to provide for you. But we have to break away because we stay here, we're going to be in the same little cycle of what's going on. It's also according to how people were right, like meaning they can figure out something to do. They were clever enough to figure out a new way to get themselves to someplace else. And they were with somebody who could teach them the most important thing, which was how to read. And how to read and how to write separated the slaves in such a huge way. Because if someone were to get away, they could at least communicate, which is what was happening on this plantation, is I'm going to teach you how to write. I'm going to teach you how to this. And you had to be in complete secret because if that happens, you're educated. And educated means I can leave. I'll figure it out.
Well, the interesting thing is that in a period when, it depended on the territory. By territory, we might call them states today, but
Mhm.
it depended upon where people were living in and the rules of the individual territories. But where the characters in the past in this book lived, um, it was already illegal for people who were enslaved to read or write, and they may be severely punished. But also, it might be that people connected to the enslavers' families were the ones teaching them to read and write. Sometimes that could happen.
Mhm.
And it might be that they wanted to teach them the scriptures, the Bible. Very often it was that.
That's
They
what.
really believed that they wanted people to learn their scriptures, and so they learned to read. Or they might have been aware that the people knew how to read or write, the people who were enslaved by them, but they didn't necessarily object to it in an overt way. However, were an enslaver to be discovered, were it found out that an enslaver knew that the people held in bondage knew how to read and write, that person also could be punished, could be fined. And in the end, this was all about money.
Mhm.
You don't want to lose money.
Yeah.
And you also don't want your reputation tarnished.
Mhm. Yeah, and both could have the thing of being able to happen. And and the jar is destroyed, and you sort of wonder if there are any shards around, were there any little pieces left? And you're constantly in the book thinking about, well, what happened to it? Where did it go? It was broken, but you take that out to the curb and throw it out. Like, what do you do with something that's a family heirloom? Are you gluing it back together with little Elmer's glue? Like, what's going to be the process here? And the jar just disappears from the family. It just is gone. Pieces and all, it's just over until
It's
we see something
gone,
new.
yeah. Yeah, until we hear the stories of the jar, because
Yes.
we realize that the jar has helped the Freeman family to form their sense of who they are. That it's not all about the hard times of the jar. It's about
Hmm.
how did the jar end up in that family, and what did the jar, in effect, witness as this family moved from hardship to great prosperity,
Hmm.
um, and how did the jar enhance family time? Because it became a source of entertainment.
Hmm.
It's a very serious thing in that family, but it became a source of entertainment. More importantly, the jar held a secret, and only members of that family knew of the secret, no one else. Nonetheless, for children, Baz is 15 when he dies, and Ebby is 10 when that terrible day occurs. They're kids. For them, the jar is like again, a sort of a mascot.
Hmm.
It's a source of pride. It has taught them something about their history and culture, but it's also fun. And so the jar keeps reappearing in this novel as a way to remind us that this was once a family that felt more whole. This
Hmm.
was once a family that were able to enjoy or better enjoy the love they felt for one another, their playfulness, their mirth. They had less fear in their lives because they were living pretty good lives. And then that terrible day sort of takes everything away. But the jar has not disappeared. The jar is part of who they are.
Hmm.
Because again, we're talking about the power of a story to help define you. Abby has to find a way to rewrite her story. She has to somehow reclaim some of what she's trying to run from because she wants to forget it all.
Hmm. And she has to allow herself to be happy. I feel like she has not allowed herself to be happy since her brother died. And she's carried blame for that. She's carried that things she did not say that she probably should have said along the way. And she's just right now, I have to get over like, the way I feel. And it's not something that's easy for her to do. And going to France, going someplace else where everyone's not supposed to know her, and then something happens, which was really funny. I mean, that moment, I could just see it on the screen of the person walks in the room and it's just like, not you, please, please, not you.
But but that's the thing. The thing is that she does think she's going to be happy when she's about to be married. Things fall apart,
Hmm.
and they fall apart in a public way. And she has struggled all her life with being in the public eye. And again, yes, moving to France does make her feel better. But is she just going to stay disappeared from herself for the rest of her life? I
Hmm.
am also fascinated by the idea of moving away to escape who you were, and that's typical of a lot of stories of people who move far away from where they grew up if they move by choice. There's so many people who feel forced to move, but what if you decide, oh, I'm going to go live there,
Yeah.
and now I'm a different person? But she can't just let go of everything that she was.
Mm-mm.
Also because I hope that by the end of the story, people begin to kind of like this young woman and learn something about her parents and,
Mhm.
her grandparents and why we might want her to move forward, forced to carry the pain of having lost her brother,
Mhm.
but also enabled to love and laugh and allow herself to be happy. Because you talked about that. She has to allow herself to be happy. She feels that she owes so much to her parents. She needs to
Mm.
just be uncomplicated, stay alive, be safe, not go very far. But all of a sudden, she's on a plane and she's gone.
And she has to take their calls. And if she doesn't take their call, they'll worry. And I think she's worried about them worrying all the steps of her life. Like that, then they could be without any child. So I need to tell you, they're very involved in her life. And I think that she needs to break away and go to France. And they're like, where are you going? Who are you going to be with? All these questions. And she's just like, I'm going. Like, I just am going to be taking this trip. You label your short chapters with character names and titles such as disquiet, potential, searching, and confrontation. And our reviewer, Jane, called that out. Were these done at the start, or did you go back in the editing process and add those?
The title of a chapter tends to come to me just as the words come to me. So
Mhm.
if I'm writing a scene, that word may come to me right away. Or I might write and then it comes up. But for me, the title is part of what I've written.
Mhm.
It may very well be that I get to the end of the novel, having basically written it and now having entered the editing phase, and I might have a chapter and think, I'm going to change that. And sometimes it's for a practical reason. I like to write from multiple points of view and
Mhm.
jump around.
Mhm.
And already that can be a challenge for any reader. And so sometimes I would go back and think, okay, I need to shift the label of this chapter so that we understand who's speaking and we understand when,
Mhm.
so that it helps to keep the reader oriented in space. But for the most part, when I'm writing, even when it's named after a person or has a date, it's just part of the chapter I'm writing.
Wow. It just, okay, this is where we're going to go. Like you feel like, oh, we're going to potential. Oh, we're going to searching. We're going to confrontation. And if it's something you're just feeling up front, that's what's going to end up happening for these people. That's where they're going to end up going.
So you mentioned a chapter, Disquiet, and I won't get into any spoilers there, but Disquiet actually probably was the first thing that came into my mind as I then wrote this scene about one character who's observing the other character, and
Hmm.
she sees the disquiet in that other character.
I'm going to check this out. Jane also says that Ebby Freeman's a character to cherish. We see the deep search for what she has forgotten and what she must remember in order to bring her quiet resolution of her own worth. And she's also not feeling that she is, completely worth anything at this point as well. She's been, with her brother, the situation, she's been left at the altar. Like, what is going to happen for this poor girl now? And our reviewer also notes that Wilkerson labels short chapters with the many character names and adds these simple titles, but at the same time, you now know exactly who you're looking at. You now know exactly where you're not trying to question which character is which because you've clearly written them the first time we've met them. So when we come back to somebody, we're there, oh, that's who that is. And that's an art because a lot of people, you're trying to figure out which was this person? What did they do? Was this a person who read or taught the people to read? Which one is this? So, do you think about that a lot of making sure they're shaped enough up front that people will remember them later on when they hit the next chapter about them?
I do try, and one of the wonderful things about the editing process, by editing, I mean after you think you've written a book and then your publisher takes a look and says, well, the great thing is when you have someone else's eyes on your manuscript, you also have people say, okay, I might get a little lost here. Sometimes they call you on it. Sometimes they say, or would you add a line or something to remind me? But the fact is that an author like me, who likes to jump around from one character to the other and back and forth in time, is telling a story in a way that won't suit every reader. But I
Hmm.
trust readers. I trust a reader to say, I can follow that person, or let me go back and listen, or to say, it's not for me. I like that single point of view. I want to follow that kind of story. Whatever the reader feels is always 100% valid. What I, as a writer, do is I love the idea of mimicking the world as I know it. So if you and I, Carol, go into a restaurant together and we sit down and we look around, we see all these different people. They're all in the room with us. They're all in our field of vision. But if we stay there long enough, we may learn something about them, but at different times and in different ways.
Hmm.
And to me, that's in a way the kind of world that I'm trying to recreate in the book.
Hmm.
It's not for everyone, but I like that feeling. I'm in a universe of characters, and let me see what each one brings to me. Someone steps forward and tells me something, and then they retreat, and then someone else comes forward and tells me something. And by the end, I'm going to get a sense of the stories of the people who are in that room with me.
Hmm. Hmm. It's exactly. And I felt that I was listening to it. I listened to January Lavoie did a fabulous job with the narration because I was in this moment of, it was the holidays and I hadn't read enough. And I said, okay, we're going to do audiobook and print book at the same time of different books just so that I can get myself ahead. And I really enjoyed it. I really enjoyed the way she told the story. And I felt like it was being performed, but at the same time, I was never lost. And that's an art of your writing paired with her doing her narration that I felt I wasn't lost as time goes on because there are times you do feel it because the inflection is not there or something else is not there. The other thing I want to share with readers is the author's note at the end is not to be missed, and it's brimming with extra reading ideas. And did you make notes for that along the way of things you'd include at the end? Like, wait a second, this is a book I read, or just turn and look at the shelf and go, here we go.
Well, no, I wasn't thinking of the author's note right away. I was doing my research and I had my files with different research, but of course I read certain books and I just have them lined up. And so as I thought of the author's note, I wanted to talk a little bit about how I ended up with a story about a 29-year-old woman from Connecticut who ends up running off to France, but then has to turn back and look at her past and piece together the connection between this family heirloom and everything that has happened to her.
Hmm.
And so I wanted to convey the fact that I'd started with Ebby, as I mentioned to you in this conversation, and everything she had been through on the emotional level, and found myself going through a process of discovery in doing research. So I did look into my files as I wrote this, but I couldn't tell the whole story. I just wanted to give an idea of the importance of the process of discovery for me and research in expanding the story of this family. Because in my mind, Carol, this is still the story of a family. It's
Hmm.
the story of a family who must find a way to carry great pain with them and move forward and continue to love and laugh and thrive, not just survive.
Hmm.
But in fact, it's, part family drama, it's part historical fiction. There's kind of quirky romance action going on, and the story grows. But the research led me in that direction in terms of historical fiction.
Yeah, people being
So,
able to have those notes are great because I want to read more about clay. I want to read more about building in the South. I want to be, it's really terrific. So the title feels perfect of being good dirt. It feels like was this always the title?
no, it wasn't always the title. For a while, it had only a working title that I used so that I'd recognize it. And then we thought about something else. Good dirt is a phrase that comes up a few times in the
Hmm.
novel. The
Hmm.
first time it's just referring to, when you smell good dirt in your garden.
Hmm.
And then it refers to the quality of soil that made it possible for those turners to make stoneware. Stoneware is a specific kind of ceramic, and they were making a certain kind of product that was highly prized, and it took a certain kind of clay and a certain kind of dirt. And so the phrase comes up a few times, and someone actually said at one point, "Ooh, good dirt." That could be an interesting title.
Hmm.
Fast forward a year or so, and we're really thinking about it. And I thought about all the ways good dirt encompassed the idea also of territory.
Hmm.
And then one more thing, gossip. You know, when we say, oh, what's the dirt on
Oh,
Carol?
that's
Give me the dirt on Carol. Good dirt. Because people often, I don't want to say they took pleasure, but they took some satisfaction in
uh-huh.
gossiping about Ebby Freeman, the protagonist in this story. They didn't mean to be cruel, but they couldn't help but gossip a bit about her. And so good dirt also refers to really the source of great pain for her,
Yes.
which is being seen, being recognized, being thought of in terms of the worst things that had happened to her.
That sounds perfect. Good dirt. I never thought about it being the good dirt the other way. I was about the clay. The cover's stunning. I mean, it's absolutely stunning. It was this the first, or did they? Because it looks like a painting. It's beautiful.
They did have a couple of different ideas, but this one came up in one of the first presentations, and everyone sort of looked at it and they're imagine a cartoon where your eyes swell, you know, and they become really big. And what's interesting about this cover, you see the jar, and
Hmm.
some people don't see the face, but there's a face in there.
Yes.
And the face is not Ebby Freeman. It's not the protagonist, but I won't tell you who, you know.
No.
Well, you know who it is, but other people will recognize that
Yeah.
face later. What's great about this cover is it was designed by the same person who designed the US cover for Black Cake.
Oh, wow.
Jaya Maselli. Jaya Maselli also came up with a concept for Black Cake that involved the sea. And if you looked at this abstract design of the sea, you'd see a face in there. So in a way, it's conceptually similar, but
Yes.
completely different. The colors are amazing.
The cover.
And I love, yeah, yeah.
I was trying to
I
decide
love
what
seeing
color
the
shirt
jar.
to wear to work with the cover.
Oh,
Because I always do
just
that.
about.
And I was like, look,
Oh,
I've got
I
some
know.
purple.
You think that way. I usually wear black, so that's easy. Yeah, I love that the jar is in there
Yeah,
because
it's
the jar
beautiful.
really is a character.
It really is beautiful. It's beautiful. So your last book was adapted to a series that I loved watching on Hulu. Any adaptation news yet, or is everything still mum, or where are we on that?
Well, we're just at the beginning of having published the US edition. The
Hmm.
UK edition, which is also distributed throughout the Commonwealth, just came out a week ago. And we're at that phase. And then we'll see if anything else comes of it. I'm just so pleased to have this opportunity to share this
Yeah,
story in print form and also audio form
yeah,
with readers.
yeah.
So we'll
January was just
see.
terrific, and it. I just felt like I wanted to get back to it all the time because she did such a great job. Are you working on something now?
I'm working on something, and it makes me think of Black Cake in that there's some food involved,
Ooh.
but it's nothing like that story. And there's no cake involved so far.
Okay.
But I'll leave it at that. It is a drama. It does involve a couple of generations, but we're not looking at a major historical element as we are seeing in Good Dirt.
Ah, well, we can't wait. Thank you so much because your books are something that when I pluck it off the shelf, I just know I'm going to be happy, like sitting and reading because
Um,
it's a different style of writing. It's something where I'm just moving along and I feel like I know the characters. I feel like I know, know their stories and I want to be part of what's going on with them. And you do a beautiful job of storytelling as well as drawing character. So congratulations. It's a
well,
good feat. Let's put it that way.
thank you very much. I'm really glad that you enjoyed this story, and I hope other readers will find something interesting in the story of Ebby Freeman and her family and the jar.
The jar. And there's a lot more to think about people after you finish this book. Charmaine, thank you so much for joining us. As always, it's wonderful to see you. There's never enough time. There's just never enough time.
Thanks to you, Carol. It's great to see you again.
And to our listeners and viewers, we'll look forward to seeing you next time on Book Reporter Talks to. Thank you for joining us.